I hung 15 trail cameras on a mix of public and private land in Iowa from September through November. I hunted there for 2 weeks, and my goal was to see how much better is the private land than the public land, or is it even better? So let's dive into these trail camera locations and see what I had on camera. I'm going to start with the private land cameras first. This camera location is right here. This camera produced a ton of buck photos. The first day in the tree stand in Iowa, I hunted this spot and I saw 12 different bucks on this scrape. So you just have this finger of timber that separates two fields, and you have a couple draws that work down through this system, a bunch of doe bedding up in here, and this scrape down here was just absolutely dynamite. So let's take a look at what we had on camera here. This camera was hung in August, so we have, I saved all the buck photos from then until now, so let's take a look. This deer here is a super funky deer. There's some other pictures of him where he has some stuff growing out the side of his face, but 2-year-old buck here on the private land scrape. There's another pretty nice short tine 10-pointer. This was a deer that I actually got an arrow in on November 14th and made a non-fatal hit, but this deer was super active down in this scrape. That's him again there. And then this deer was super active on this farm. Probably the most mature deer that I had on camera on the private land. You can see this scrape is just super, super active. That's the deer again that I ended up hitting. That deer here, if you look at this, that's the stuff that's kind of growing out of his face there. It's pretty funky, but he was a super active deer in that area too, and super territorial. This deer here is the biggest deer that I had on camera in Iowa, and I had him in the summer months in velvet. I had him on video on a mineral, and he's probably high 60s, low 70s deer, and he broke off his G3, as you can see in these photos here, but just an absolute tank of a buck. We'll move down here on the map. This is another scrape here. This is where I actually ended up getting an arrow in that big 8-pointer. This camera was super active as well, so let's check those photos out. This camera here is still actually out in the woods, so I have some more recent photos, and I don't have all the HDs, so here's what we came up with there. Here is that 8-pointer crossing in front of the camera the day before I got an arrow in him. And November 15th was just an absolutely incredible day in this area. I wasn't able to hunt because I was waiting on the dog tracker to see if I had a fatal shot on that deer, and just an absolutely incredible morning. And as you can see here, here's that big mainframe 11-point, and there's that wound. Absolutely incredible deer. We have this really, really nice hillside here that's just all full of high CRP grass, and you got some cedar trees mixed in. And then if you zoom out, we have some ag fields up in here. This was beans, this was corn, and this fence row here, it was super, super productive. So that was another private land location that produced a lot of big bucks. But those two cameras pretty much encompassed all of the deer that I had on the private land piece. Now let's take a look at what I was able to get on camera on the public land. I had cameras on mainly scrape locations that I found in postseason scouting in March. There was a really nice primary scrape on this bur oak tree. This was a really productive trail camera for public land for me. So let's take a look at what we had on camera there. As far as public land trail cameras go, this bur oak tree was one of my most productive cameras, and let's break down this area here. So out here you had a bean field, and then on this side, on the south side of the scrape, this was actually planted in turnips this year. This little pocket of timber held a bunch of does, And then as we go further south, these willow thickets here, these held a bunch of deer as well. My thought on this location was that these deer were going to kind of hug this timber edge, but what I found was a lot of the deer were just coming straight out of these willow thickets, headed north and hitting this bur oak tree. So this scrape was really productive. It was a tree that we found in March, and there was a scrape underneath every single limb there. I hunted this a few times, passed some really nice public land bucks here, but there was one deer in particular that I wanted to get a crack at, and I was just a couple days behind him, but it was a really nice mature 8-pointer. If we move to the east here, I have another camera location that we found in the postseason scouting, and it was a really, really active scrape, and it was a camera that produced a ton of different bucks. This location here was headed down this oxbow, and there was some doe bedding kind of to the north, and I'm sure there was some more buck bedding down to the south. I never did go check that out because I found some really, really good sign up here. So this camera was hot from like October 30th through November 5th time frame. This camera was on fire. I had some really good hunts in this area. I never saw a mature buck from the tree in this area, but I had a bunch of good bucks on camera, and that is a camera location that for years moving forward, I'm going to have a camera there because that was a producer. As we move a little bit further west here, we have a small chunk of public land that actually had a lot of human pressure, but it still produced some really good bucks. I had 3 cameras on this piece. I had one camera here on a scrape that had some good buck activity, nothing really, really big. Had a really tall 8-pointer, hit it a few times. Straight to the east of that was a saddle that we found this saddle in the August time frame, and we hung a camera on this. This camera here had a lot of human activity. It still had some really good bucks on it, but sometime in November, the card got stolen from this camera, so I don't have photos all the way through the months of November, but here are some of the best bucks that I had on camera on this piece. As we move down east a little bit further, there was another camera location that was really productive and had some really, really big deer on here. Not super consistent, definitely not consistent enough for me to throw a sit at it, and mixed with all of the pressure that was on this particular piece and how small it was, I didn't opt to hunt it. But if I would have access through the river, I do think this camera location would have produced a big deer. Now, as we move further to the west, this was an area that I scouted in October, and I hung a camera on a scrape line, and this camera turned out to be a really good producer too right off the bat. But as the rut progressed, the camera activity slowed down a bunch. This was another area that I really wanted to access from the river with a north wind. We had some buck bedding over here on this edge in this oxbow. We had some doe bedding up in this area here on a north wind. I wanted to come in from the southeast on this river. My wind would be blowing back across the river, and I probably could have set up on this edge somewhere and caught a buck cruising down the edge, headed to some of that doe bedding. But for a public land piece, definitely was an area that I'm going to spend some more time in. Right here, we had another camera location on some public land that was in a dried up creek bank, and this was kind of right on the edge of some private land that had some food sources on the public. We thought this camera was going to produce a lot more. It did have some activity throughout November, but it wasn't an area that I spent any time in because there just wasn't a whole lot of consistency. But still some really nice public land Iowa bucks on this camera too. I did another video breaking down all the data that I gathered from public and private land in Iowa. What days produced the most daylight buck activity? If you want to find out what those days were, click this link right up here, and we'll see you next time.